My name is Josh Brahm with Equal Rights Institute, and we're taking a close look at the Reversing Roe documentary. Finally, let's talk about the clear gender bias in this documentary. As you can probably already tell from some of the clips that we've watched, the narrative of the documentary is that mean white men are trying to control women's bodies. It's not particularly original, but that's what the documentary makers want you to believe. So they made sure that when pro-choice people were on screen or being heard from, there were almost always women. And they made sure that when pro-lifers are on screen, they're almost always men. Think I'm exaggerating? I actually did a deep dive analysis of every time that you see people on screen, either speaking or their voiceover being played, or you see them in B-roll, featured in the foreground. So then I would pause the film, I would take a screenshot, I would enter the time code in a spreadsheet and note how many people you can see or hear from that haven't already been featured in the documentary. So just to be clear about how I did this. So just because they show multiple clips of Rick Perry saying pro-life things, he's only counted once in this spreadsheet as a pro-life male who speaks or has a voiceover. So let's take a look at the numbers that I ended up with once I did that process and did it the exact same way the entire time, and then ended up with numbers at the end. So let's start with the people who don't speak but are just seen. For example, there are lots of B-roll shots of protests. And I had to work out a consistent way to do this. This was actually the trickiest part of this. Like, should I count every single head that you can technically see in a really big wide shot of 100 protesters? I didn't end up doing that. Basically what I would do, and I did it consistently the same way, was I would count the heads that are in shots of large marches who are in the foreground, who are kind of featured, that you can kind of see what's going on. But then when it came to a bunch of people in the background, I just wouldn't count those people at all, whether or not it was a pro-life protest or a pro-choice protest, just because a lot of times it would be hard to tell if the footage was blurry. It's sometimes hard to tell what gender the person is, or are they even on the pro-life side or the pro-choice side. You had sometimes shots where there's a pro-life and a pro-choice protest going on in the same shot. So that just would get too complicated. So I'm just counting, the people that are featured in the foreground that your eyes are meant to look at in those shots. So when it came to pro-life people who were seen but not heard, there's no voiceover, there's no interview with them, 82 of them were men and 48 of them were women. In contrast, when it came to pro-choice people who were seen but not heard, 22 of them were men and 110 of them were women. In other words, 63% of pro-life people who didn't speak were men, and 83% of pro-choice people who didn't speak were women. Now let's talk about those people who got interviewed for the documentary or their voice is heard through B-roll. Because I think in either case, like being able to hear someone's voice saying things on either the pro-life or the pro-choice side, that's more meaningful than just someone got briefly shown in B-roll of like a protest or something like that. So when it comes to people who are actually heard, either in interviews or their voice, when it comes to men, 40 of them are pro-life and only 5 of them are pro-choice. And when it comes to women who got interviewed, 7 of them are pro-life and 38 of them are pro-choice. Said another way, 85% of the pro-life speakers are men and 88% of the pro-choice speakers are women. Now, there's something about the gender bias in this documentary that actually doesn't come through in just those numbers. Because remember, those numbers, I'm counting people only once. So Dr. Colleen McNicholas, I counted her once in that spreadsheet, even though they go back to her a lot of times. Similarly, Troy Newman is shown quite a bit, but he's only counted once in that spreadsheet. So what I wanted to do was also get a sense of how many literally minutes and seconds they give people who are saying either pro-life things or pro-choice things. And as you can see from the numbers on the screen, there is a lot more time given to pro-choice people than they give to people defending the pro-life side of things. Now, someone could argue that this is fair because most full-time pro-life advocates are men. Now, I don't even know if that's true. I'm not sure if there are any stats on that. But I do know that some of the most prominent pro-life leaders are women, like Kristen Hawkins, Abby Johnson, Lila Rose, Charmaine Yost, and Catherine Glenn Foster. Weirdly, you never saw any of these people Instead, if they wanted to feature pro-life people speaking, they mainly featured Troy Newman, Randall Terry, and various politicians. The main exception was that they did have several interview clips from Carol Tobias, the president of National Right to Life. So then I started researching the documentary, and I found out that the documentary makers, Ricki and Annie Sundberg, actually filmed lots of interviews with female pro-life leaders, and then they cut out almost all of them during editing. The Washington Free Beacon and the Media Research Center report that at least 5 pro-life women were interviewed for the documentary, some for days, and then completely cut from the film. And you can actually figure out who some of those women are by looking closely at the credits, where these women are listed in the special thanks section. So when I took a look at that section, I could see some people's names whom I recognized. Abby Johnson from And Then There Were None, Catherine Glenn Foster from Americans United for Life, Cheryl Soldier from Operation Rescue. Now, I know in her case, she was offered the chance to be interviewed and she chose not to be interviewed, but she did provide some research. So that's why she's listed there. It's not the same as Abby Johnson. I know that Destiny Herndon Della Rosa from New Wave Feminists was interviewed for a long time. They completely cut her from the documentary. I know that Jeannie Mancini from the National March for Life was interviewed, completely cut from the film. The only mystery here was Kristen Hawkins. So I actually reached out to Kristen and asked her, were you interviewed for the film? Like you're mentioned in the special thanks of this documentary. And she was really surprised by that. She has no idea why she's mentioned. She doesn't know that they even reached out to Students for Life at all. So for some reason she's mentioned. But that's multiple pro-life women who were interviewed and cut from the documentary. And then there were other prominent leaders like Lila Rose and Kristen Hawkins, again, who weren't even offered the chance to speak on behalf of the pro-life movement. Now, the case of Catherine Glenn Foster from Americans United for Life not being included is particularly egregious because one of the pro-choice people on the documentary is featured explicitly saying that Americans United for Life is, quote, one of the main pro-life players, end quote, in this battle.
Americans United for Life is one of the main players in this.
Yet, as NewsBusters points out, the documentary makers have actually claimed to be trying to tell both sides of the debate. Here's a quote from Ricki in an interview with the Dartmouth College newspaper. By working on this film about women's reproductive rights, we're looking to tell both sides of this very divisive issue in America, end quote. I listened to an interview that Film School Radio's podcast did of both of the documentary makers. And at one point, the interviewer actually says, quote, I've seen a number of films on abortion rights, women's rights. This is the first time I can recall seeing a film that is as even-handed in its presentation. We see all the different points of view on this issue, end quote. And then talks about how the film goes against common tendencies toward confirmation bias, to which the makers respond that they definitely wanted to feature thought leaders from both sides of the debate. So, yeah, they technically did include people from both sides, so they can say that. But when you take a closer look at how they handled people from both sides of the debate when editing the film, you can see that there is an attempt to say, see, we featured both sides, and yet make you very uncomfortable with pro-life people. It's more underhanded than something as obvious as not interviewing anybody on the opposite side of the debate. The New York Times definitely agrees that the documentary is biased in their review. They said, quote, while there's no doubt that the film has been made from a pro-abortion rights perspective, it gives voice to other points of view. It's less interested in rendering a verdict on the morality of abortion than it is in tracing the increasing politicization of the issue. So here's my question for my pro-choice friends that are watching this, or just any pro-choice people who are watching this analysis. Do you see this documentary as being fair to both sides? Or is it just something that in the end might be useful in motivating inactive pro-choice people? Here's another question for our entire society to consider. Should documentaries attempt to be neutral? Because that was not attempted here. Just having some quotes from a couple of pro-life leaders and mainly jarring and old news footage doesn't equate to neutrality when compared to dozens of pro-choice advocates and doctors who are portrayed as heroes who are always on the defensive. This doesn't just bug me because the other side did it. Documentaries are actually more persuasive if they attempt to be even-handed because then you can trust the information you're taking in. because you trust the people who are delivering that information to you. We do the same thing with people. We take more seriously the beliefs of intellectually honest people who have studied both sides of an issue and then have come to a conclusion than we do people who only watch MSNBC or only watch Fox News and strawman the other side all the time. As I explained in our Equipped for Life course video about being open-minded, those people may be confident, but they haven't earned their confidence. Is it really impossible to make a fair and balanced documentary? I strongly doubt that it's impossible, but reversing Roe is definitely not it.